The wind whispered across the wide plains of Eastern Europe, carrying echoes of distant hoofbeats that once thundered across the horizon. In that swath of fertile land, the meeting ground of countless peoples and tribes, the year was 1302. A time that witnessed the rise and fall of mighty powers, the forging of new alliances, and the shifting of borders like grains of sand in the palm of history. There, on a stretch of territory near the Sinuka River, an event took place that would later be overlooked by many chroniclers of great conquests. While battles such as Kulikovo or Grunwald have often been etched into the collective memory of the region, the Battle of Blue Waters remained, for centuries, a nearly forgotten episode. Yet its impact on local powers and its ripple effects across the continent were tremendous. In this clash, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania emerged to challenge the Mongol Golden Horde, its troops forging their own destiny under the leadership of the Grand Duke Algirdas. At stake was not simply land, but the fate of principalities that yearned to break free from the yoke of external domination. The question of whether a new power could rise to shape Eastern Europe, and the extent to which the Mongols' once unstoppable influence could be tested. On the eve of that fateful encounter, the region was an expanse of unending steppe and forested glades. Rivers meandered across the land, vital arteries that nourished early settlements and guided travelers and merchant caravans alike. In the generation before, the Mongols, often referred to as the Tatars in local parlance, had spread their influence far and wide, subjugating principalities through tribute and, on occasion, with devastating raids. Their reputation for swift cavalry tactics and organizational discipline was legendary. Yet by the mid-14th century, cracks had started appearing in the vast dominion of the Golden Horde. Internal power struggles, shifting alliances, and the logistical challenges of controlling enormous swathes of territory made it harder for the Mongol Empire to project its strength with the same ruthless efficiency it once had. Where once the sight of a Mongol cavalryman would send entire towns into frenzied terror, now local powers were beginning to test the limits of Mongol authority, searching for moments of weakness to reclaim control of their lands. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania, in particular, had undergone a transformation under the leadership of Gediminas, and then later under his successors, including his son Algirdas. This emergent state began as a relatively small domain in the Baltic region, but expanded dramatically, often through diplomacy, strategic marriages, and conquests. Rather than relying on a single ethnic core, the Grand Duchy managed to create a multi-ethnic realm that included Lithuanians, Ruthenians, Poles, and various other groups. A key to their success was the tolerance that Lithuanian rulers extended toward different religions and cultures in their territories, thus quelling rebellions and securing loyalty from diverse peoples. By 1362, Algirdas had set his sights on consolidating control over crucial trade routes that threaded through the principalities of what is now Ukraine. The presence of Mongol tribute collectors in these regions was not only an affront to Algirdas's sense of sovereignty, but also a direct threat to the economic stability he was carefully constructing. As Algirdas mobilized his forces, word spread through local towns and villages that the Grand Duke was determined to remove Mongol influence once and for all. From the vantage point of a small settlement perched on the banks of the Dnieper, one could see a swirl of energy and hope. Craftsmen worked day and night forging weapons, mending armor, and constructing wagons. The smithies glowed with an intense orange heat, sparks leaping into the open air like miniature stars. Eager young men, some who had only known the quiet rhythms of field and farm, joined ranks alongside grizzled veterans of previous campaigns. Church bells tolled not only for prayer, but to remind everyone of the coming confrontation. On the opposing side, the Mongol commanders were not oblivious to the new threat emerging on their western front. They understood that the Grand Duchy's expansion into historically Mongol tributary lands was no mere skirmish. It was a bold act of defiance. Stories told by traveling merchants, spies, and outriders painted a clear picture of Algirdas's ambition. Yet within the horde, uncertainties prevailed. Some believed a direct and swift reprisal was necessary, mustering a large contingent of Mongol cavalry to ride down these rebellious upstarts. Others, wearied by internal strife and the recollection of recent difficulties in collecting tribute, saw the Lithuanian threat as only one of many crises brewing. The horde's leadership deliberated late into the night, uncertain whether dispatching a major force was prudent or if they should handle the matter with a smaller contingent. Ultimately, a decision was reached. A substantial force would set out under the banner of the horde, confident they could quell any rebellious spirit with a show of strength and cunning. Meanwhile, Algirdas himself sought the wisdom of his most trusted confidants. Among them was Karajotas, one of his brothers, who had proved himself an able leader in previous campaigns, and a circle of veteran princes. While Common Council suggested a steady, methodical approach, reclaiming one fortress at a time, Algirdas decided on a more daring tactic. His plan hinged on gathering allies from local principalities who were weary of Mongol tribute and saw in the Lithuanian Duke a liberator rather than a conqueror. He dispatched envoys to these neighboring territories, offering them alliances that guaranteed the protection of local aristocracy and the freedom of religious practice. Many local princes, though initially wary, recognized this moment in history. Either they rise up together or continue living under the Mongols' shadow for another generation. These negotiations were tense, punctuated by moments of suspicion. Some local nobles had cut deals with the Mongols to preserve their status. Aligning themselves with Lithuania could mean the risk of losing everything should the horde retaliate. But Algirdas' envoys spoke persuasively. They highlighted the wealth that could be garnered if the trade routes were freed from Mongol tolls, the pride that could be restored in local governance, and the symbolic importance of standing up to a power that many believed had grown corrupt and detached from the people's needs. Thus, a coalition formed, a patchwork of the Grand Duchy's forces, along with knights, cavalry, and foot soldiers from various localities who dreamed of independence. They gathered on Lithuania's southern frontier. Camps dotted the fields, forming an impromptu city of tents and wagons. Each morning, the allied princes and leaders would meet near the largest pavilion, where Algirdas held court. Maps were unrolled and strategies debated. The main objective, it was decided, was to strike quickly at Mongol garrisons and strongholds that guarded crucial crossing points. In doing so, they would create confusion in Mongol lines and prevent reinforcements from easily regrouping. Morale in the Lithuanian-led camp was high, buoyed by the sense that a tide in history was turning. Still, the memory of Mongol might lingered heavily. The older warriors remembered the terror wrought by the Golden Horde a generation or two earlier. Entire cities ravaged, populations displaced, and fearful tributes extracted. These veterans insisted on rigorous training and discipline, reminding the younger men that, despite recent setbacks, the Mongols remained formidable cavalrymen. Nightly drills were held, Horses were carefully tended, and scouts were dispatched to gather intelligence on the movements of the Mongol forces. The scent of impending conflict grew sharper with each sunrise, fueling both excitement and dread in the camp. The Mongol leadership, meanwhile, had begun its westward march. Rows of horsemen stretched out along the horizon, their armor catching the glint of the midday sun. Banners bearing the emblem of the Golden Horde fluttered in the breeze, a sight that in earlier decades would have triggered panic across the steppe. But these soldiers now were traveling across a land that, for many years, had offered them tribute rather than outright rebellion. Tensions were high among the command structure. The ranks were large enough to intimidate local princes who resisted tribute collection, but the question remained whether they were prepared for a full-scale conflict against a well-organized coalition. At each campsite along the route, Mongol officers called their men to attention, reminding them of the proud legacy of Genghis Khan and the unbroken chain of victories that brought the horde to these lands. But for every confident word, there were doubts unspoken. Rumors of the Grand Duchy's skilled crossbowmen and the discipline of newly formed infantry units. Familiar with warfare on open steppe, the Mongol cavalry were slightly less at ease maneuvering in forested or marshy terrain, where their swift charges could be blunted. Moreover, the presence of allied forces, particularly mounted troops from local principalities, hinted that their opponents were no longer inexperienced militias. Here was a united front, armed with knowledge of Mongol tactics and guided by a single strategic vision. As the distance between the two forces narrowed, the aura of a historic confrontation hung over the land. Farmers, hearing rumors of advancing armies, hurried to gather their last harvest, anxious to flee if conflict spilled onto their fields. A hush of anticipation settled on villages and towns. Traders hustled to hide valuable goods, lest they be caught in the path of pillaging armies. In the ephemeral calm before the clash, even nature seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. The sky grayed over, and a chill wind brushed the leaves of the forests. Finally, the two armies made contact near a place known in local lore as Blue Waters, named for the vibrant hue that the river sometimes took under the midday sun, reflecting a sky that in peaceful times promised quiet days of fishing and trade. This area was as strategic as it was picturesque. The river crossing and surrounding landscape offered natural defenses, as well as routes for swift movement of cavalry. To one side, the Lithuanian-led coalition arranged itself with care. Algirdas and his fellow princes commanded from a central position, their cavalry forming a line on the wings, while archers and infantry took the center. The allied contingents stood side by side, each bearing the insignia of its own principality, forging unity out of diversity. On the other side, the Mongol forces positioned their horse archers in several lines, with heavier cavalry held in reserve. Their intention was to break the enemy's formation with a barrage of arrows, followed by a thunderous charge that would exploit any breach in the Allied lines. The Mongol commanders placed immense confidence in their tried and tested warfare tactics, a whirlwind of arrow volleys meant to confuse and weaken the enemy, followed by swift maneuvers that capitalized on panic. However, they faced a foe that had learned from decades of Mongol dominance and had prepared accordingly. At dawn, as a pale sun rose behind a shroud of clouds, the first signals went up. Horns resounded across the field, and both sides advanced into the clearing. The Mongol horse archers let loose their opening salvo of arrows, darkening the sky in an ominous shower. Yet the Lithuanian and allied archers answered in kind. A fierce exchange rattled the early morning. The men in the front lines raised shields, bracing against the hail of arrow points. Though casualties were inevitable, the disciplined ranks held firm. Within moments, Algirdas's cavalry on the wings began to push forward, engaging the Mongol flanks. The clamor of steel on steel filled the air as lances collided with shields, swords clashed against axes, and war cries mingled into an echoing roar. Smoke drifted across the battleground from small brush fires ignited by stray flaming arrows. In the center, foot soldiers advanced at a measured pace, spears angled upward to deter cavalry charges, while behind them, crossbowmen and archers fired in disciplined volleys. The Mongol cavalry, traditionally the masters of encirclement, attempted to wheel around the Allied formation and strike from the rear. Yet the local princes, well aware of these tactics, had positioned their own mounted reserves for precisely such a maneuver. There, a swirling melee erupted. Horses collided, riders grappled in mid-saddle, and the ground was soon dotted with wounded men and animals. The beating of hooves churned the once lush grassland into a muddy, blood-soaked expanse. Onlookers, had there been any who dared to watch from a distance, would have seen a nightmarish dance. Organized ranks swiftly dissolving into chaotic clusters of strife, then reassembling in determined cohesion. Amid the chaos, Algirdas's voice rang out. He was at the heart of the fray, commanding and rallying his forces. It was said that his presence alone inspired confidence in the Allied lines. Veterans told of how he rode with an unerring calm, scanning the battlefield for weak points in the Mongol line. When he spotted an opportunity on the Mongol left flank, where the horde's heavy cavalry was spread too thin, he signaled for a coordinated assault. The Allied cavalry under several local princes converged, striking with precision. The Mongol formation, already battered by relentless arrow volleys, began to falter. On the Mongol side, their captains fought valiantly to restore order. They launched repeated counterattacks, focusing on pockets of Allied soldiers who had overextended their lines. In these heated moments, the skill of the Mongol horsemen shone. Many a Lithuanian or Ruthenian warrior found themselves ambushed by swift cavalry tactics honed over generations. For every inch of ground gained, the Allies had to pay a steep price in blood and effort. As midday approached, the tide of the battle ebbed and flowed. The Mongols had inflicted substantial casualties, but so had the Allied forces. Breaking for a moment to regroup, Algirdas conferred with his council of princes. Their scouts reported that Mongol reserves were thin and that their supply lines were miles away, making it difficult for the horde to replenish arrows or fresh mounts. Realizing that speed and aggression were their best allies, Algirdas ordered a renewed offensive across the front. The horns sounded again, and a mighty roar erupted from the Allied lines as they surged forward. The Mongols responded with a last-ditch effort. A cavalry charge aimed at punching through the Allied center. Horse archers galloped at breakneck speed, loosing arrows, even as they closed in for direct combat. But the disciplined ranks of the Allied infantry had reformed. Spearmen steadied their weapons, archers released salvo after salvo, and cavalry units on the wings closed in, forcing the Mongols into a deadly pocket of conflict. It was here, at the heart of the battlefield near the banks of those blue waters, that the Mongols began to break. Their scattered formations could no longer maintain cohesion. Some tried to rally under their banners, but confusion and exhaustion took hold. Fearing encirclement, many Mongol contingents retreated, leaving the field in disarray. The Allied cavalry gave pursuit, driving the fleeing enemy away from the river crossing. By late afternoon, the battle had reached a definitive conclusion. The Mongol forces, once deemed invincible in this region, were decisively defeated. In the aftermath, the battlefield was a grim tableau. Fallen warriors from both sides lay in heaps. The once verdant grassland, now a trampled, blood-stained mire. Crows circled overhead, drawn by the carnage. Algirdas and his allies called for a swift accounting of the wounded and the dead. They saw to it that the bodies of the slain were given proper rites according to their traditions, a gesture of respect that, in that age, was sometimes afforded between fierce enemies. Word traveled quickly through the region that the Grand Duchy of Lithuania had struck a blow against the seemingly unstoppable Golden Horde. Local principalities that had wavered now sensed a major shift. No longer was the Mongol tribute an unavoidable fact of life. A new order, with the Lithuanian Duke at its apex, was crystallizing before their eyes. Celebrations in the Lithuanian camp were tinged with sorrow for the fallen, but buoyed by the knowledge that history had been made. At a hastily convened war council, Algirdas thanked his allies for their courage and loyalty, promising to respect the autonomy of the territories that had stood by him. He also called for the immediate fortification of strategic posts along major trade routes to secure this newly won independence. Garrisoned forts would guard against any Mongol attempt at swift reprisal, and local boyars were encouraged to train militias in case smaller Mongol raiding parties tested their resolve. Local chroniclers, scribes, and minstrels gathered around the Allied camp, eager to set down the record of what they had witnessed. Some wrote in Latin, others in Ruthenian, while traveling storytellers composed ballads in the language of the common folk. Though many details varied in these accounts, one central truth remained. The day belonged to the Lithuanian-led coalition. What was once unthinkable, a Mongol defeat in open battle on this scale, had transpired before their very eyes. In some quarters, the victory was compared to the mythic triumphs recounted in epic tales, a sign that the times of Mongol dominance over certain eastern lands might be drawing to a close. Yet, for all the fanfare, Algirdas and his circle of commanders remained cautious. They knew that the Mongols, though wounded, were far from broken entirely. Rumors circulated of new khans rising, and of potential alliances that might threaten the emerging Lithuanian power. The Grand Duchy did not have the luxury of complacency. It needed to consolidate its victories, strengthen its fortifications, and carefully negotiate alliances both westward toward Poland and Hungary, and eastward among the Slavic principalities. Nevertheless, the psychological blow dealt to the Golden Horde was real, sowing doubts in the minds of those who had long believed in Mongol invincibility. In the months that followed, Blue Waters became a symbolic name that roused the hopes of the subjugated. Merchants traveling from the Baltic to the Black Sea told stories of the battle, weaving in dramatic flair about how the Mongol horses stumbled in the mud, how the Allied cavalry bravely outmaneuvered the horde's flanking attempts, and how the sky itself seemed to darken as if in mourning for the epic that had passed. These stories circulated in taverns and market squares, capturing the imagination of those who wondered if other powers might also test Mongol authority. Within the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, Algirdas set about reorganizing the newly acquired territories. Local princes who had supported his campaign were granted semi-autonomous rule, but they were also bound by oath to defend the duchy's interests. Lithuanian administrators arrived to establish consistent legal structures, unify currency systems where possible, and facilitate trade. Orthodox churches and Catholic missions coexisted, reflecting Algirdas's policy of religious tolerance that would keep potential unrest at bay. Observers marveled that in a land once fractured by rivalries, a sense of collective identity was slowly emerging. Life for the common folk in these territories started to improve, if gradually. Freed from the constant drain of Mongol tribute and the fear of raids, local peasants devoted more time to tilling their fields, tending livestock, and rebuilding settlements that had been neglected or ravaged. Craftsmen, seeing new markets opening up, produced goods that traveled along trade routes linking the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. A renewed confidence took root. This was not a utopia, but a time of cautious optimism, born from the realization that political and military changes could indeed reshape people's lives for the better. Of course, old animosities and fresh ambitions coexisted. Some local princes grew uneasy about the growing influence of Lithuania, fearing that one form of overlordship might simply be replaced by another. Envoys from the Grand Duchy worked tirelessly to assuage these concerns, granting charters and privileges to localities that pledged loyal service. In return, local nobility found that their standing improved through ties to a larger political entity, which could defend their interests against outside threats. Farther east, the Golden Horde reeled from the defeat. The scale of the setback forced the Mongol leadership to reconsider their strategies. While internal power struggles had already begun to weaken the Horde, the Battle of Blue Waters accelerated this fragmentation. Some factions favored a renewed offensive to restore their prestige, while others preached caution, insisting that resources should be directed toward consolidating control over the core regions of the Horde. Over time, these divisions grew, making it increasingly difficult for the Horde to mount a concerted campaign against Lithuania. For generations thereafter, local storytellers wove the Battle of Blue Waters into their oral traditions. It became a story of emancipation, courage, and unity among diverse peoples, even if the historical complexities were sometimes lost in the telling. Knights were cast as chivalrous heroes, archers as uncanny marksmen, and Algirdas himself took on an almost mythic aura in certain renditions, portrayed as a monarch anointed by destiny to confront the greatest empire of that era. In this legendary storytelling, the mundane realities of diplomacy, logistical preparation, and the harsh consequences of warfare were largely overlooked. But for those who had fought and bled on that field, the recollection of arrow volleys in the early morning, the clash of steel, and the roar of war horses remained vivid until their dying days. One cannot exaggerate the broader significance of this conflict. While later battles like Kulikovo in 1380 received far greater attention in chronicles and narratives, often hailed as the decisive blow against Mongol hegemony in the region, Blue Waters played a substantial role in laying the groundwork for a changing power dynamic. It demonstrated that the Horde was not invincible, emboldening various Slavic and Eastern European principalities to negotiate for better terms or even consider outright defiance. It also elevated the Grand Duchy of Lithuania to a major power broker, creating a bulwark against Mongol expansion into Eastern Europe. and setting the stage for future alliances, most notably with the Kingdom of Poland. Yet, for reasons both political and cultural, the memory of this battle would be overshadowed. Over the centuries, the Grand Duchy merged dynastically with Poland, forming a commonwealth that became the focus of historical reflection in that region. Russian chronicles often concentrated on the battles fought closer to the core of Muscovy, such as Kulikovo, where Prince Dmitry Donskoy took a stand. Ukrainian and Belarusian chronicles, too, faced centuries of complex imperial overlays that made it challenging to keep alive the memory of a 14th century victory. Nonetheless, the story persisted at a local level, carried forth by archivists and enthusiastic amateurs of history who pored over ancient manuscripts, searching for references to the day the Mongol horde was turned back. Their discovery of old letters, genealogical records, and early chronicles fueled a renewed scholarly interest in the 20th and 21st centuries. Academics debated the precise location of the battlefield, the exact numbers involved, and the nature of the alliances that were struck. Yet the undisputed truth remained. The Mongols suffered a defeat here that shook their previously unassailable position in the region. Today, although ruins of old fortresses have crumbled, and the region's political landscape has changed countless times, one can still stand by the banks of that quiet river, often now called the Sinuka, and imagine the thunder of hooves, the cries of warriors, and the swirl of banners that once dominated this picturesque setting. The local people might guide you to a patch of ground where they believe arrowheads and fragments of armor were found, testaments to a day that fused legends, heartbreak, and a bold new vision for Eastern Europe. The wind carries faint whispers, telling of an age when empires collided and new realms were forged. In recounting this tale, it is essential to remember that history rarely follows a single, neat narrative. Instead, it unfolds through countless actions, decisions, and alliances, some fleeting, others enduring. The Battle of Blue Waters was one of those pivotal intersections. If it did not alone topple the Mongol hold on Eastern Europe, it certainly cracked the foundation enough for others to follow suit. Without this victory, the expansion of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania might have stalled. Future alliances, including the eventual union with Poland, might have taken an entirely different shape, and the fate of numerous Eastern European principalities could have remained under Mongol influence for decades longer. And so, the name Blue Waters, while not as frequently inscribed in school textbooks or lauded in grand national epics, resonates in the hearts of those who delve deeply into the story of this region. It speaks of ambition, that of Algirdas, determined to create a vast, multi-ethnic state, which in many ways was ahead of its time in governance. It speaks of defiance, local princes rejecting the yoke of tribute and forging a fragile but ultimately potent coalition. It speaks of transition, the shift from Mongol dominance toward a more fragmented sphere of influence, where local states could carve out their own destinies. And perhaps most poignantly, it speaks of the bravery and sacrifice of countless unnamed warriors who gave their lives in service of a vision, or simply obeyed the call to arms, forging a page in history's ledger that would be only partially remembered but wholly felt. Historians might debate the precise scope of the victory and whether its significance has been exaggerated or downplayed in various times. The facts are that it was a strategic triumph that opened the path for Lithuanian influence over much of what is now Ukraine, including the important cities of Kiev and others along the trade routes. Culturally, the region would later experience a flowering of arts, architecture, and literature, partly as a result of reduced conflict and increased trade opportunities. Politically, the alliances made during this campaign laid the groundwork for further expansions and set the stage for collisions with other regional powers, including the Teutonic Order and, in future centuries, the rising states of Central and Eastern Europe. Legends say that, on the evening of the victory, Algirdas walked along the riverbank, pausing to reflect on what had been achieved. He supposedly gazed upon the waters that no longer looked blue, but were tinged with the red of the day's sacrifice. Around him, the final rays of sunset merged with the dim light of early stars, illuminating a world forever changed by the outcome of one pivotal battle. Whether the details of that moment are apocryphal or not, the sentiment remains profound. A single day's events can tilt the course of nations, shaping the path for generations. Those who survived the battle carried forward tales of valor and horror alike. Some found themselves ennobled for their heroism, offered lands and titles as reward. Others returned to modest farmsteads, haunted by the memories of carnage. The local environment, too, bore the scars. Fields once used for grazing turned into makeshift burial grounds for fallen men and horses. Over time, nature reclaimed these patches of land, and the human footprint dissolved into the wild. Only stories remained to mark their passing, stories that have now been revived by historians and enthusiasts who crave a deeper understanding of the forces that molded this corner of the world. Those who survived the battle carried forward tales of valor and horror alike. Some found themselves ennobled for their heroism, offered lands and titles as reward. Others returned to modest farmsteads, haunted by the memories of carnage. The local environment, too, bore the scars. Fields once used for grazing turned into makeshift burial grounds for fallen men and horses. Over time, nature reclaimed these patches of land, and the human footprint dissolved into the wild. Only stories remained to mark their passing, stories that have now been revived by historians and enthusiasts who crave a deeper understanding of the forces that molded this corner of the world. Perhaps the greatest tribute to the significance of the Battle of Blue Waters is how it helped shape a conceptual sense of unity among various Eastern European peoples. By joining forces against the Mongols, local powers discovered a shared cause that transcended linguistic and cultural boundaries. In time, this sense of cooperative defense would serve as a foundation for broader alliances, culminating in influential unions that affected the balance of power across the continent. Even the religious dimension, a factor that so often divided medieval Europe, found compromise under the pragmatic rule of Lithuanian dukes, who valued stability and cohesion over dogmatic conflicts. It is also worth remembering the silent participants in this historical drama. The women, children, and elderly who waited anxiously in towns and villages, praying for the safe return of their men. In many respects, their fate was tied to the outcome of the confrontation at Blue Waters. Victory meant fewer raids, less oppression, and the possibility of rebuilding shattered livelihoods. Defeat would have spelled a reinforcement of the Mongol yoke, and perhaps further devastation through punitive expeditions. These unrecorded lives composed the social tapestry of medieval Eastern Europe, and the events of 1362 touched them all deeply, even if their names never appeared in the annals of kings and princes. And so, as this story draws to a close, one is reminded that history's pages are filled with battles both famous and obscure, with heroes both exalted and unsung. The Battle of Blue Waters stands as a testament to how a supposedly minor or forgotten event can shift the trajectory of entire nations. While overshadowed by subsequent conflicts, its influence quietly wove itself into the political, social, and cultural fabric of Eastern Europe. To truly appreciate the complexity and richness of the past, we must look beyond the grand narratives and pay homage to the lesser-known but equally pivotal moments that shaped the world we know. This is the legacy of the Battle of Blue Waters, a turning point at a time when the Mongols seemed impregnable, an affirmation of collective will among a mosaic of peoples, and an enduring symbol of resilience and courage. It reminds us that even in a region crisscrossed by countless armies over the centuries, where city walls have risen and fallen time and again, and where empires have vied for control, there remains a wellspring of stories that speak to the boundless capacity of humankind to dream of and fight for a better future. Far from the glamorous courts of Western Europe or the bustling capitals of Asia, on a quiet stretch of land where the river still flows, a long-ago battle stands as an emblem that even the mightiest forces can be tested, and sometimes they can be overcome by those who refuse to surrender their home, their dignity, or their destiny.